Dr. David Allen. Welcome to our show.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
And so, what are the topics that you think are some that you want to talk about?
Well, lately I've been blogging a lot and become sort of a critic of the whole mental health field because I think they're focusing in on certain phenomena which are counterproductive in terms of helping people getting over certain maladaptive behavior forms. A lot of this is driven by financial interests, both big drug companies, pharma, and insurance companies, which won't pay for long-term psychotherapy anymore at all, even in conditions that have been shown conclusively require long-term psychotherapy.
Okay.
So we see psychologists trying to get prescribing privileges, and the basic problem is they've gone from, well, they've always looked at people as if a lot of their problems occur just inside their skull. That has nothing to do with their social environment.
But the fact is that there are external triggers as well.
Well, there's almost always external triggers. Now, it's funny, there was a school of psychotherapy called behaviorism, which looked almost exclusively at external triggers, although they seem to think that electric shocks and food pellets were more reinforcing than other people. But human beings are kind of the most social of all animals. So to think that they're not responding to the social environment is basically nonsense. Now, I'm not talking about real brain disorders, and I often get criticism for the anti-psychiatry people who think I'm on their side, and I'm really not, because with conditions like psychosis, schizophrenia, real bipolar disorder, as opposed to what passes for bipolar. Now, we can talk a little bit about that later, but those are real brain conditions. Now, our knowledge of the brain is very minimal, so we can't always prove that something is caused by an organic lesion. A lot of people try to establish the fact that they are organic by comparing brain scans, MRIs and fMRIs in particular, and they'll find a difference between a diagnostic group and another group, but they often don't match up. If they repeat the MRIs over and over again, it changes. Plus, a lot of other conditions will be the same. And there's something called neuroplasticity, which means that the brain changes literally, physically, in response to the environment. You become accustomed to certain things happening in your environment, and your responses become automatic.
So then, would it be appropriate or inappropriate to call that there is a chemical imbalance?
Well, chemical imbalance has gotten a lot of bad press because it was used as a means to try and talk people into taking antidepressants. You have a chemical imbalance, but we don't know that that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
People that really know this don't use that phrase.
Okay.
They say there seems to be problems with certain chemicals in the brain that help one cell communicate to the other.
So basically, what you're trying to say is that study has evolved. It used to be used first, but not anymore. And now there are better ways of saying that, but in a better way, and more. I would say more in a medical format.
Well, again, the brain is involved in everything, obviously. So everything is a brain function. So the question is, what's a disease and what's just normal neuroplasticity in response to the environment?
Okay.
Like I said, about 80% of what we do is done without any conscious deliberation whatsoever, according to this guy, I can't remember his name, who did a show on the brain on PBS that we're talking about.
Okay.
This. In other words, you don't have to, if you go up to a door, you don't have to think, oh, should I open it or which hand should I? You'd be paralyzed if you had to do that. And it's also true of a social environment. Like the population that I talk about and was treating and specializing in was a group called borderline personality disorder. And they were thought to be overreactive, but they never asked what it was they were reacting to. They did studies where people kept diaries of every time they had an emotional reaction, but they didn't write down what it was going on in the environment that they were actually reacting to.
Okay.
So if you have a high index of suspicion because you live in a dangerous environment, called error management theory, you have it's adapted to have a high index of suspicion, especially of other people. If they are kind of duplicitous and are going to mess you up in one way or another, you have to have a high level. So it's not being overly responsive. It is in a sense because they apply it sort of all over the place.
Okay.
But they can stop.
Okay. So, but let me go to just the foundational thing you mentioned, that when you say there is a person who has a borderline personality disorder, that person acts or reacts based on the circumstances.
Well, their whole life experience, and particularly their family and upbringing, as I will get into.
Very good. Okay. So there are so many factors. But one of the things is that it is because that they have that disorder. There is, in their mind, they can think of that this person is an enemy. And whether he or she is an enemy or not, if it is embedded in their psyche that, oh, this is an enemy, then they will react in such a way. And whatever that person says or does is taken as something that, oh, he is harming me, or she's doing this to me.
Yeah.
And then the reaction based on that, whether the action in the first place is against the person who has a disorder or not, is then the factor that based on what they react.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit more complicated because
Okay.
it's partially, like I said, you learn to respond to environments. So there's certain environments where this is way more likely to happen than in other environments. With borderline personality disorders, anybody who's trying to fix them, guess what therapists do? They try to fix. So they act this way, but only with family members, spouses, and lovers, and therapists. They don't act that way. If you watch them on a psychiatric ward, which I've done many times, and they don't know that people are paying attention, they're just acting completely normally. I think I mentioned that the last time, where you can go to a rock concert or something, and you can just see them enjoying the concert. You would never know that they were going home and cutting themselves, for instance, and stuff like that, because they only do that when certain things happen. But those are automatic responses. Plus, they have a high level suspicion of certain people because those people often are trying to fix them. Okay. But they invite it too because they are playing a role. This is where my theory gets very different from the current one. They're playing a role in their family whereas they are not doing self-destructive things for selfish reasons. That's a contradiction in terms. How can you be self-destructive and selfish at the same time? So because people keep making the same mistakes, so to speak, over and over again, and they don't seem to learn from it, you have to come up with some explanation for why they keep doing it then. So the usual explanations are they're either mad, bad, or stupid. Okay? Either they're evil, they're sociopaths or something like that, or they're psychotic, but they're not, or they're just plain stupid. They have the IQ of a kumquat, I always like to say. In other words, if you see the same thing over and over again, you've got to know that if you do it again, you're going to probably get the same results. But it's only within certain contexts. Now, schizophrenia, as opposed to what we're talking about now, when they are psychotic and having delusions, it doesn't matter what the social context is. They're like that 24/7. It gets a little better, a little bit worse, but they're always. That's how I tell the difference between a disease and just a behavioral problem, which is learned, I think. So, in my experience, it's very clear. When they know they're being watched, they act one way. But schizophrenia doesn't matter whether they're being watched. I mean, put them in a room all by themselves, and they don't know they're being watched by cameras, and they picked up running nude on the freeway. They don't, they're psychotic. I often joke that that people don't think there are brain diseases. Well, what about Alzheimer's disease? Maybe,
right. Yeah.
Maybe we should let them.
And some of the things that what you're saying, from what I understand, like first of all, if just this, I'm taking just ourselves out of psychiatry and psychology, and just in a social life, if you see somebody is really dumb, some people act dumb. Okay,
they do act, but it's an act,
right? Yeah,
it's an act.
and the fact is that if somebody in a group or even one-on-one, somebody says you are dumb, even that dumb person doesn't like it. If is a fool, if you say you're a fool, the fool doesn't like it.
Well, there are people with low intelligence, and there are foolish people that aren't falling into this category, but they don't do it all the time, constantly. Correct. It's only, again, in certain contexts where that happens.
People who are highly intelligent, who are like from their childhood, they have been acing all their tests and A pluses and all of that, and those people also have some issues. And let us say they act crazy. you do not tell that person that you're crazy, because when they're acting crazy, they are in a state of mind, and whether it is schizophrenia or whether it is borderline personality disorder, then they might take that person as an enemy,
Well, sure.
right?
If
If
you're
you are
attacking them,
correct, right?
well, this is important. So when I first started, I gave this story last time about when I first started
Mm-hmm.
that uh, they were just impossible, and they would make you miserable and threaten you and
Mm-hmm.
threaten to commit suicide and run out of the room and call you at all hours of the night. And I go, why is anybody acting like this if they're not mad, bad, or stupid? So I guess I could say they're evil. But then I found out if you did certain things, like you could validate parts of what they're saying and just ignore all the BS that goes around it, they would stop. But it took me, and I wasn't in the books on how to do that. And validation was not even a word back then. There's a treatment for borderline called dialectical behavior therapy, where they talk a lot about invalidation, but they don't really do much about the people that are doing the invalidating. But if you find something that you can agree with and just ignore all the BS, then they calm down and they quit. Beginning trainees, I was a residency director, could do it. So they're aiming for certain reactions, and they're very good at getting them, by the way. So they're known as manipulative. They're very manipulative because they can get people to do things they wouldn't normally do. But on the other hand, they're thought to have a deficit in their ability to understand what other people are thinking about and why they act the way they do. And they're also thought to have a difficulty seeing good and bad and strengths and weaknesses in people at the same time. So I always ask, well, how can they do both of those? How can they be good manipulators if they don't know people's strengths and weaknesses? That would be impossible.
Right.
So they're actually very good at it. They're actually better at it than most people, but you wouldn't know it because they're putting on an act. So why are they putting on an act? Well, that's what I had to get to the bottom of.
Okay.
And I started out reading all the different schools of therapy. Now, the thing about psychotherapy is they have all these schools. There's more than 200. Most of them are sub-schools of the main 5, which are the old psychoanalytic or psychodynamic, cognitive, the behavioral, the emotion-focused, and family systems, which was the last thing I came to. A friend of mine turned me on to it. And there were 3 main schools of family systems therapy. The leaders are now passed away, and unfortunately, you don't hear much about family systems in psychology schools anymore. It's pretty much disappeared. It's in some master's programs, and counseling programs. It's still talked about. But I thought it was very powerful because they were looking at people interacting and feeding into each other's craziness. And then I came across this analyst who talked about how people play a role to stabilize their parents. And I go, well, how? Well, I thought, as an American, we tend to think that people are selfish. So if they're doing it, it must be for some selfish person. But again, how can you be self-destructive and selfish
at the same
time if you're not an idiot? Basically. So he talked about, I think, 4 roles. One was called the savior, where somebody acts out their parents' repressed ambitions. And why was it repressed? He really didn't get into that. And then there was the avenger, which was like a sociopath who was acting out their parents' repressed anger and hostility. Then there was the go-between, who was stabilizing their parents' marriage by letting them all focus on them instead of each other.
Okay.
And then I was looking at the borderline. He didn't come up with a role for that, but the original person that described the role, who was, I think, kind of psychotic herself, Melanie Klein, talked about something called spoiling behavior.
Okay.
Where when somebody tries to do something good for you, you take it and ruin it. You buy something for it, they lose it. You try to stop them from suicide, they tell you you're full of crap and you don't care about them. Anything you try to do, they'll ruin. You see this in kids all the time now, unfortunately, where they get so much stuff that they just keep asking for more and more and more, even when the parents can't afford it anymore, and blah, blah, blah. So again, well, why would they need them to do this spoiling behavior? Well, I came across this, which I think I also mentioned last time, a concept from evolutionary biology called kin selection. And as I mentioned, 80% of them evolutionary biologists don't want to talk about it. They say they don't believe it, but they really do. But it's just because it's politically incorrect. There was an essay in a New York magazine in 1975 that included some very famous names in the field, who say we can't talk about that because people are going to use that as an excuse for social Darwinism. I go, well, you could use it for that, but you don't have to.
Mm.
But it says that group survival, in evolutionary speakings, was way more important than individual survival. So if a group is threatened, people are genetically predisposed to sacrifice themselves in certain circumstances
Okay.
to maintain the group, because you could have the best genes in the world, but if you get killed before you reproduce, guess what?
Yeah.
Not there anymore. So, and yes, why are people willing to die for their country in a war? That's my, I get sarcastic, like I showed the D-Day invasion where the troops are going into almost certain death, and they're going forward. I go,
Yeah.
these people are trying to, maximize their chances for reproductive success, aren't they? I go, well, no, they're going to get killed. Probably they didn't have sperm banks in those days. Yeah, I found probably not a good idea to get that sarcastic in groups because people get mad at you. But that's sort of
Right.
so they're doing it because we are programmed to do that. Okay. Now, how do we learn about the universe when we come in as a baby? We don't know how to lift our hand even. We don't know how gravity works.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know anything about how the universe works. So where do we learn
Okay.
it? We learn it from our parents.
Mm-hmm.
And since mothers still do most of the child
Mm-hmm.
rearing, even though men are doing more and more, they're still lagging
Right.
significantly. Yeah, it's sort of the mother-child relationship. And that's what psychoanalysts focused on, although their problem was they seemed to think that things that were only important if they happened in the first 5 years of life, and after that it didn't make any difference anymore, which to me is absolutely ridiculous. But let me talk about what's going on during infancy.
Okay.
Okay, when a mother and a child are interacting,
Mm-hmm.
okay, synapses are the connections between nerve cells. There's, 1 billion nerve cells or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And 700 connections per second are made during mother-baby social interactions.
700
per second. Now they're cut down later in life. They're pruned, it's called. When you get to be a teenager, probably for the ones that don't get reinforced.
Yeah.
It's use it or lose it.
Because when they're teenagers, they know they know everything.
Right.
Okay. Right.
Okay, but the bit about neuroplasticity is that neurons that wire together fire together. That's what.
Yeah.
Okay, so that they're formed. So there's actually cells in the especially in the fight or flight mechanism and fear tracts in part of the brain called the amygdala that respond only to your parents and nothing else. Okay, so obviously they're going to be more influential and important than almost any other environmental fact. Plus, they're teaching you your social rules. When they do studies of personality traits, they find a lot of genetic components, but I think they're exaggerated because there's certain problems in the research that they
Correct. I totally agree with it. Yes.
Okay, but they only study like general tendencies like introversion or something like that. They don't study why a woman marries a series of alcoholics one after another, gets rid of one, goes to a bar, meets another one over and over. They don't look at that. Plus, they think that parents treat all their children the same, which is complete nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of family systems guy that I like, Bowen, talked about how one or two kids out of a group can be sort of tagged as you're it. He doesn't use those terms, I kind of did. And they get all the craziness. And the others kind of escape scot-free unless something happens to it, and then one of them comes and steps in and takes their place, which doesn't happen very often because the parents have chosen who's going to be it, and everybody else just respects that. They sound like they're being selfish and screwing their siblings, but no, they're just going along with the program.
True. And one of the things that I have found about personality tests, whether it's Brigg-Myers or anybody else, the thing is that when you offer it to, I don't know, maybe school classmates or people working in a company or people in a workshop, whatever it is, when you offer those tests, then every person while taking the test has a different psychological thinking of how he or she will respond.
And different motives.
And motives. You're absolutely right.
What do I want this test to show? And how can I make it show that even if it's fake?
Fake, exactly. So then, which means then what the results of those tests are skewed.
Exactly.
But now when I have posed these questions to the person who is administering those tests, they said, oh, you know what? You're right. It gets skewed. But because that person is thinking on that level, then you have to address only that much. I said, then if it does, it misses the point then, right? Because that person is he's misleading not only himself, but he's misleading you. And you are saying, okay, I'm ready to be misled.
Okay, so people's motives make a difference. Like, why do some groups do routinely, on average, again, we're talking about averages, not individuals,
Correct.
do poorly on IQ tests? Well, motivation might, if you don't care,
Yeah, or lack of motive. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not going to try as hard. You're going to do worse.
True.
So some groups have different attitudes about acting smart.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it was dangerous for some people to do that in some days. And these kind of fears, which is the other part of this, create conflicts in people because they want to be smart, but they're not supposed to act that way. So they pretend they don't want to be smart.
I have seen that too.
Yeah, but they really kind of feel badly inside, but you never know unless you know how to get it out of them.
Right. And see, the thinking is that, oh, I don't want them to know that I'm smart. I just want to pretend. So in that case, are they doing harm to themselves in the long run?
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And because the thing is that then everybody perceives that he's dumb. Right? And they treat him that way.
And he goes along with it.
Exactly.
He pretends to
protest. He keeps on.
He pretends to protest, but he's really going along with it the whole time.
Correct. And
so
then
everybody
he ends
discounts
up,
what he says.
And he eventually ends up hurting himself.
Well, you don't accomplish much if you don't want to act smart.
Yeah.
Okay, so groups and individuals within groups have been traumatized by things that happened 2 or 3 generations ago.
Mm-hmm.
The environment's changed. Some of it's still a factor, but it's not nearly as bad as it was 3 generations ago.
Mm-hmm.
But these conflicts get passed down from one generation to another. That's another thing I think the analysts had wrong. They were looking at conflicts over wishes versus fears, basically.
Okay.
But they thought, again, it was all inside the one person rather than the whole family shares the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And because you're conflicted and ambivalent, you give off mixed messages.
True.
So I try to figure out, well, how do people read mixed messages from their family?
Yeah,
because if you bring it up, you're giving me contradictory information. I can't predict exactly what will happen, but it ain't gonna be good. It could be either they're gonna shift, the parents will shift in their chair and change the subject, anything till they'll beat the crap out of you and knock you across the room.
Mm-hmm.
Anything or everything in between. What I can predict is that they aren't going to answer the question. I think because they're ashamed.
Okay, either not
solve this.
Either not answer or not answer it correctly.
Right, or talk around it, or beg the question. It must be true because I say it is. I say it's true because it is. It's a circular kind of reading. So then they have to ask, well, how do I act then? So I got a clue from a TV interview, believe it or not. There was a 9-year-old girl. I can't remember her name right off the bat. This is a true story. And she got her 15 minutes of fame because she was in a fundamentalist church and she sang on a record about child abuse. And she was getting all this stuff in the media saying how wonderful that was and blah, blah, blah. So she was sitting with her parents in the background.
Okay.
In the picture. And the journalist says to the parents, oh, how is she handling all this newfound fame? Like, how's it going to her head, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
And they look at each other, then they look at the child and goes, what will happen if you're too proud? And she goes, I'll fall flat on my face. Interesting.
Okay.
So you can't act too proud. Now remember, she's in a fundamentalist religion group where pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. You're not supposed to be proud. You're supposed to fit in with what God tells you, which is. But the odd part was in the background, you could tell that the parents, when she answered, were acting as proud as they possibly could be of having her answer that way. So I'm thinking, how is she going to read? That's a double message. They're telling her what the church says, don't be proud, but they're acting proud. So what? And then she was interviewed for People magazine, and they had the exact same conversation. The same thing happened. I didn't see the picture this time, but so obviously they had coached her to say, "I'll fall flat on my face if I act too proud," because she used the same words again. I mean, I can't prove that, right? But come on, what are the odds that wasn't coached? Pretty remote, I would think. Again, People say, well, you can't prove that. Well, no, you can't. I mean, I can't prove that the sky is going to look blue to you on a sunny day at noon
Mm-hmm.
if you're not colorblind. But I kind of, I kind of think that's,
Right.
anecdotal evidence, right?
Right.
People joke that, they have to do a study to find out that parachutes reduce the risk of death and injuries when you fall out of an airplane. Can you volunteer for the study? We'll give you a placebo. Come on. Yeah, anecdotes alone can't. We have thousands of anecdotes. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
all of psychology is based on anecdotes because we can't read minds, and our knowledge of science is really primitive at this point. It's getting a lot better, and genes change too. There's something called epigenetics. Genes are turned off and on. Most of your genes are not turned on. Your genes in your spleen have the genes for your whole body, but they aren't turned on because they're only there in the spleen. That's what they're for. So if you have a social interactions, that turns off and on genes as well.
Right. So
And they can-
circumstantial thing.
Yeah. So, and what's environmental and what's organic? Well, everything is both, and they're
Connected.
interconnection.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, well, do I know of any cases where people get, devil messages?
Mm-hmm.
And I related one that I knew very well. Let's say your mother
Mm-hmm.
is constantly complaining about doing housework,
Okay.
but that's all she seems to want to do,
And still keeps on complaining.
and keeps on complaining and rejects all offers of help
Okay.
in one way or another, or it's not good enough. I see a wrinkle in the bedspread, so you didn't make the bed right. Okay, so wait a minute. You want you want me to help because you don't want to do all the housework, or don't you? Well, how can I come up with a behavior? And this is where dialectical thinking comes in, because this is what dialectics is all about. You have two opposite things, and you have to come up with a synthesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out there's an easy solution to this: is you make more of a mess. Well, why would you do that? Well, because it allows your mother to do more housework, which you think is what she wants to do, because that's all she ever does.
Okay.
And it gives her cause to criticize you for not helping, in fact, making things worse. So it helps both of those things at the same time by making more of a mess.
Okay. So
I didn't
now,
do that, but yeah.
okay. So now in this scenario, what is the right thing to do? To let her continue is what you're saying?
Well, for a kid, you're kind of at the mercy of that. You're just going to keep going.
Okay.
But
Now,
as an
but if
adult,
you're-
later on, when it affects your life later on, then you've got to figure
Okay.
out, if I change and I don't do all the housework, like I focus on my career, for instance, like a good feminist would, she gets depressed because she didn't get to do that.
Okay. So as a husband, then what would he do? What steps should he take to address this thing?
Well, the solution is to be able to talk about why people are acting this way. Okay.
Okay.
You can't solve a problem if you can't talk about it, but nobody wants to talk about it because there's a big shame factor and there's a lot of conditioning involved. So people react very negatively.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you do talk about it, there's something called the game without end, which is, well, you said you don't really want to do all the housework, but is that really true? I mean, I kind of would like to believe that, but so like the husband will say, well, I'll help with the help, but he always puts the dishes in the wrong place. And then she criticizes him, and he goes, see, she didn't really want me to help in the first place, even though he did it in an annoying way on purpose.
Okay.
So of course she's going to do that. The solution to that is for her to say, well, I really appreciate you doing that, but I would also appreciate it if you put this over here, so we know that's the antidote.
Okay.
Okay, but most people don't know about that. They just get angry and they don't talk about it anymore.
Okay. So and what would happen if the husband, and I'm just going into all the circumstantial and stretching it even more. So the husband is saying, okay, let us talk about it. And the mother in this case gets offended. Oh, how can you do that? I'm doing this. Yeah, I mean, I'm doing it. And she's complaining and she still keeps on doing. And the husband offers help.
Mm-hmm.
He says, okay, I can hire maids or people who can do this stuff. And she says, no, I am the housewife. This is my job. I want to do it.
It's her kingdom. The kitchen is her kingdom.
Kingdom. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So now,
But she's complaining about it.
correct. So how should
Okay, but the
husband
question
have-
is why is she acting that way?
Okay.
If you don't know why she's acting that way,
Mhm.
you can't really figure out the best way to approach her. Well, what I found out is that I mentioned it earlier. If she breaks the mold and becomes a feminist, say, her mother gets depressed because she didn't get to do it. And then the whole family comes out and jumps on her and goes, "How can you treat your mother this way?"
Okay.
Whoa. When your whole family does that to you, guess what? It's extremely powerful. You can resist it, but there's a terror that comes out. You don't know who you are anymore. It's called existential groundlessness, because you've been existential groundlessness.
Okay.
It's the feeling that you don't know who you are because your false self, this persona or false self or role that you've been playing all those years, feels real, and your real self, your real inclinations, which are mostly genetic probably, but also partly environmental, so you turn it down. That feels like a false self because you've repressed it in order to play out the role.
So the situation that you mentioned now, you're calling it, sorry, can you repeat it?
Existential, as in existentialism, groundlessness.
Groundlessness. So that is what the mother is going through.
If she tries to change, because the parents are reacting negatively. Like, I was never taught as the analysts were teaching the residents back when I was in training, they never said to ask the patient, "What does your mother-in-law think about all this?"
Okay, yeah.
So when I started asking those questions, boom, all this stuff starts coming out.
Opening of the floodgates.
Okay, so wait a minute. So why would your husband put up with this for so long? Well, guess what? Because his family has the same gender conflicts that you do. He thinks that he's supposed to be the man of the house and that he's pussy whipped, pardon the language. If he isn't, he does the housework, then all his buddies go, yeah, and rib him. And his father comes down on him like, you're just letting your wife run your wild and all that. He goes, "Oh my God."
Okay.
So each one is playing a role in their family org, and what they're really doing is enabling each other. You have to look at the whole picture. If you look at one relationship, you're missing what's really going on. So because the in-laws are feeding into this all the time. And even if they're dead, there's usually some family members that are continuing. Plus, you have these models in your head that have been reinforced for all this time. So you're automatically doing all this stuff.
Right.
But when I found, there's a famous question that one of the early analysts asked, Alfred Adler, which also opened this up for me, aside the fact that I heard tapes of parents interacting with their adult children, and I brought them into the office and observed it and stuff like that. But the question later became the magic question, another one that's used in family systems, is, gee, what would happen if this problem were solved? Well, I have a magic wand, okay? And the problem goes away. So you don't act like that anymore. And they usually say, well, I'll just find some other way to screw it up. I go, well, my magic wand won't let you do that. Okay, so I get two reactions when I do them. One, they blurt out what's really happening. I had taught a resident to do that, and he goes, the lady couldn't keep a job, blah, blah, blah. What would happen if you were really successful? And she immediately says, well, my mother wouldn't know what to do with herself, and she'd stop sending me money. Oh, gee, how come you never mentioned that before?
Right.
That sounds like it might be a factor here.
Exactly.
Or they get quiet. So you get quiet. The therapist gets quiet. And you don't criticize them for getting quiet. You just sit there and listen like a good old-fashioned analyst would, except you're waiting for them to kind of answer the question. And they'll start to refer to the issues that are involved in the question eventually if you do that. And then you can ask for clarification and have them, it's called the Columbo style of questioning, where I said, you said this and then you said that. How does that, can you help me understand that? And if you ask for their help, instead of saying, you're contradicting yourself, which is going to get you absolutely nowhere, then they want to help you, and then they start telling you all the stuff that they neglected. I had patients that were PhD students that kept the reason they were having these problems, which was fairly obvious. You never even mentioned it for 3 or 4 months in therapy. It's like, why wouldn't you think about the fact that when you were in this doctorate program, your mother called you every day and asked you how you were possibly handling, you have a kid, and oh my God, you must be, every day, and you felt nauseous afterwards. You're coming here complaining about anxiety and low mood, and you never thought to tell me that something was happening every day that made you feel nauseous, and you didn't think to bring that up.
Yeah.
So therapists don't know about this stuff because they don't know how to get it out of people. Now, it may sound narcissistic, but I think I developed ways to first find out that they're not telling me the whole story.
Correct.
They're very ambiguous in a lot of ways. They use logical fallacies, which I used to think were just errors in thinking, but now I know there's ways to keep certain conclusions from forming. They avoided looking at certain kinds of information, although in order to avoid looking at that information, you had to know where not to look. So at some point, you must have looked.
Right.
Okay. So, and there are plot holes. I'm from Hollywood. So they would tell a story, and I go, wait a minute, how did that happen? And when this happened, it must have been some other. And again, you do this, well, help me understand better. And then they kind of clarify.
Right. And but what you have mentioned it, I mean, I find it very disturbing when, I don't know, psychiatrists do that, or psychologists, or counselors, or therapists. But I think that what you said is right, that when a patient comes to you or a client comes to you, then they just want to present their beautiful self. They are there to solve the problem, but they are putting it only from one perspective.
Right, but they're also protecting their family. That's the other part.
Correct. Very
it's
true.
not just protecting themselves.
In
they're
some
protecting their families.
Right. Now, in some cases, if there is a problem between a husband and a wife, then husband will say, oh, no, this is what she is. But he might not mention all the wrongs that he does.
How he feeds into it, actually.
Well, so then it is essential, like you mentioned, that you need to understand all the sides, not maybe her side and his side.
You got all the sides. Plus, you have to go back another generation, because if you blame the parents, it's not a question of blame. I want to mention that again in a minute.
Okay.
But then you have to ask, well, why are they acting that way? Right? Well, guess what? They learned to act that way from their families.
Correct.
So Bowen, this family systems guy that I really like, he did what he called genograms. He traced these things back at least 3 generations. And all this information started to come out. Of course, he focused more on whether parents and children were enmeshed, which means they couldn't survive without each other, or distant and angry with each other. But that's called process. But he didn't focus on content. That could be that way about love and marriage, but not that way about work. It's content specific, whether you're enmeshed or hostile.
Right.
It's not across the board everything. Now, there are parents that continually act not nasty, and there's a whole literature about toxic parents. And I think they're doing that to push you away, because they think secretly that you're better off without them. I know people look at me like, well, how else? Why would they not want to have a good relationship with their own kids?
Right.
So I did a personal therapist named Lorna Benjamin called Hatefulness is a Gift of Love. Okay. But then after you think about it, you are sort of better off. But even people that are glad to take the toxic parent route and cut them off, first of all, they're not completely cut off, because they're communicating through third parties. So messages are still coming back. I only found one patient in my life that didn't talk to any family members, hadn't in years, to know whether they were alive or dead. But she played out conversations in her head every single day with the same result.
Wow.
Okay, so you almost did. So I found that the parents were far more influential in changing their kids' behavior than a therapist could ever be. But again, therapy, so it's not a matter of blame, because as one Bowen therapist in town once said, Sylvia Landau was a social worker, she's since passed away, they're really all beans in the same soup, especially when they get to be adults. Children, it's another matter if you're abusing your children. And they know it's wrong. So you can't, I distinguish between sympathy and empathy. Empathy means I can understand why you felt like you had to do that, but I don't agree with it. That was a good idea. Whereas sympathy is, oh, it was okay. Well, if you tell a child abuser that what he did was really okay, he's going to know you're full of crap, because he knows it's not okay. I mean, again, you can't, if you presume people are smart instead of stupid, then you don't get taken in by these dumb arguments. Oh, it probably was good for her. Turn her how to handle the trauma. What? They don't believe that. Not really.
Okay.
But they'll say that, so you get mad at them. So you want me to think that you're the villain, even though you're saying you're not, because you're denying the obvious. In some families, the victim of child abuse gets blamed by the mother for being seductive when she was 3. I mean, I'm not kidding.
No, hold on.
Really?
Can you
if a girl who was sexually abused by her father finally spills the beans to her mom, mom blames her for being seductive.
At age 3.
At age 3, when it happened. Or 5, or whatever it was.
Okay.
I don't remember much when you're 3, but let's say age 5. Yeah, okay.
I see.
But even then, I mean, it's like, and then the whole false memory stuff, because that gets misused by certain therapists in the past, where they would hypnotize people and convince suggestible patients that their parents had done certain things. But why are they that suggestible? That's a whole other issue. So they say, child abuse isn't nearly as common as people think. And there's also a camp that thinks it's way more common than it actually is. The fathers who are afraid to hug their teenage daughters because they're going to be accused of, sexually molesting them. So, so why do we have this? The people in denial just don't want to look at what's really happening. So, there's something like 1,400 children are killed by their parents every year or so in this country. So I guess they just imagined that they were dead. It wasn't, again, I'm being sarcastic, but come on, there really is child. But are the people that are abused purposely say it in such a way that nobody believes them? Like Roseanne Barr is famous. I heard about her when I worked as a therapist in Burbank, where all the studios were, and I didn't know her personally. So I'm just relating what was said about her. And they said that she was just awful on set. She'd fire people at the drop of a hat for nothing, and the crew and stuff like that.
Okay.
And you see her, in public, and she's really okay. But she said she was molested, and she remembers being molested at 6 months old. So nobody remembers something that happened to them when they were 6 months old. So she's not being honest. She's just trying to blame that. Well, I guarantee you something else happened, and it wasn't just at 6 months old. But we don't know what that was, but we're not going to ask because we think that she's just lying to cover it up. But because it's obviously a lie, if you're going to get caught in a lie, what would be the purpose of telling it? Other than to get people to think you're a liar.
Right, but and there would be also cases where a liar knows that nobody is going to go beyond and ask questions.
Well, especially if you act like you're a liar and then deny it. Who's going to believe you after that?
Right. But there are people who just keep on, if they keep on repeating that lie, for them, that lie becomes a truth.
Well, they act as if it's truth, and they act as if they believe it. They act as if they believe it.
Believe it, yeah.
It's called Willful Blindness. There was a book by that title.
Okay.
Where you just ignore all the evidence that you're making this up, and you act as though, so you really believe there's something else I call the actor's paradox. People are really good actors when it comes to this stuff. They're very good. They can convince anybody that this is what's going on, get them to respond in certain ways. So they're like method actors. In order to be a good method actor, you have to really believe that you're the character you're playing. You have to really believe that you're the person in that role is actually you. Because if you don't believe that, you're not going to be as good at it.
Wow.
So I know.
So they really
it's like method.
get under the skin of that. Yeah.
There was a movie called Awakenings that had Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, and Robert De Niro was between takes and he was still in character. And Robin Williams couldn't even get him to crack up. So if he couldn't get him out of character, I mean, come on. Of course, he's a professional actor. But when it comes to this stuff, everybody's like a professional actor. They're really, really good at it.
Yeah.
Not everything, but when it comes to this stuff, it's important to stabilizing their own parents. So what did spoiling behavior do? Why did that stabilize anybody where everything they try to do for you, you ruin? Well, as I started learning more about each family, and again, every family was different in a lot of ways, but there was a common recurring theme, and that was the parents were highly ambivalent about having children, period. They thought it was the end all and be all of human existence is to have kids. But really they hated it because they could interfere with their careers and interfere with a lot of other stuff that they do. So sometimes they'd act really guilty because they weren't doing enough for that, and then they come and they overindulge their kids, and then they'd be angry about it. And they seem to hate the kid. There was a book I think called "I Need You, I Hate You," which really focused on exactly that. So you're a kid in this family. Well, what do you do? Well, it turns out spoiling behavior is brilliant because, first of all, you never grow up, so they have to keep taking care of you. But you're acting in such awful ways that you give them excuse to be pissed at you. So if they're feeling too guilty, you make them angry. And if they're feeling too angry, you make them feel guilty. So they're controlling their parents' emotional state and preventing them from collapsing into a complete, mess.
Right.
So it's brilliant. I mean, that's the taking these two opposite things and putting them into a one particular role.
Yeah.
So once I found that, I started looking for it. Now again, they're just telling me what I wanted to hear. Well, first of all, nobody knows about. I'm the only one that's been sort of writing about it this way, so they couldn't possibly know what I really wanted to hear. But I might be shaping their behavior. So I would try to be skeptical and challenge it all the time. And if I thought I saw something, I would say, well, I don't know if this is happening in your family, but in other families I've seen, this is what's happening. If I just said this is happening in your family, they'd get mad at me. But if I say that, then all of a sudden it's, oh, you got that. How did you know? Because you're not forcing them to admit that may not, and it may not, because there's other factors involved in this stuff.
And of course, because you are looking at these cases like 5 or 10 in a day, you know how to maneuver, you know how to ask, and you know how to get them out.
Well, yeah, I had 45 years of experience. I didn't know at the beginning. Boy, I had patients who try to kill me.
Oh, okay.
Because I was really unempathic. She wanted to be discharged from the hospital, and I said, well, you've got to go. And then she just grabs the lamp on me, comes at me with the point and everything. I wrestle it away from her. Then she grabs these phones. Used to weigh something back then. I tried to bash me with the phone. Finally, luckily, it's a small woman, or I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. They rolled in the hall, and the nurses came and pulled her off. And I go, why does anybody want to be in a mental hospital? But what I didn't ask is, gee, why are you afraid to go home? That's what I should have said.
Yeah.
That would have been the empathic
Correct.
thing to say.
That's, yeah.
Instead of, you're an idiot. You should want to go home.
Correct.
So she went into a rage. Nowadays, if she goes into a rage like that, she gets labeled as bipolar. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, it was she's reacting to something. She's not. She doesn't have a brain disease.
Yeah. True. Okay. So now, as we come to the close of today's thing, I would like you to talk about how you would like to end today's show and complete whatever you need.
Well, I think the field has gone away from looking at other people and systems, and to my mind, the serenity prayer from Alcoholics Anonymous really sums up where they should be going, which is that you use mindfulness is really big right now, where you teach people to have better, higher stress tolerance.
Yeah.
But if somebody's walking around, as I said, stabbing you in the shoulder with a penknife, I mean, we could put you on an opiate so it wouldn't hurt so much, or we could try to get the guy to stop hitting you with the penknife. So the serenity class said the serenity to put up with things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Yes.
Well, my level on the things you can change is much higher. But nowadays, people are getting labeled as being crazy, so they can be put on a pill by pharma, and so insurance won't have to pay for long-term. There's a pill for everything now.
Yeah.
So they've kind of gotten away with it. There's another thing called the fundamental attribution error, which people have a natural tendency to attribute why somebody does what they're doing in front of you to what's their internal factors and discount what it is they're reacting to. And that's exactly, it's called the fundamental attribution error, because it's usually wrong. It's usually a combination of both, but the environment is usually more important. Or the history. You have to know the whole history.
Right.
And unless you have cameras on people 24 hours a day, you don't know what they're really reacting to, because that's another problem with today's thing. Even, and this is the problem with old-time therapy, is everything was important trauma. It's all when you were, at the time of the trauma, usually in early childhood. As if, well, what happens if you have a relationship with the person that caused the trauma ongoing at that point? Does that not have an effect? Of course it does. It's still going on.
Yeah.
If it wasn't going on, you'd probably get over it in most cases, unless it was something really horrible, like, watching ISIS gun down your family or something like that. But even then, you have poor distress tolerance because you're upset when you saw that you should calm down, use mindfulness technique. Well, that's something you couldn't change. But what if you could stop them from killing you? You want me to be mindful instead of stopping them from? I'm exaggerating and being sarcastic. I watch that a little bit, but that's where the field is going. It's all in your head. It's got nothing to do with other people feeding in and triggering it, and it's got nothing to do with your whole social environment. It's all because there's something wrong with you, and it's happening even in businesses. Like doctors now are being practices are being taken over by business people, and they get pressure to see more and more patients and do all this wasted time doing checklists on electronic, and they're spending less time with the patients. If they spend much time at all, they're cutting and pasting notes. So somebody else trying to figure out what the heck was going on, you can't figure out why they changed the medicine, for instance, because they don't say. So when the doctors start getting upset about this, I'll end up quickly. But when they get stressed out about it, they're told, well, you need mindfulness training because you have poor distress tolerance. No, you need to form a union and tell them to knock it off. That's what you need to do. To say that you have poor testosterone is really insulting.
Hmm.
And it's stupid because that's not going to fix the problem.
Okay. So, Dr. Allen,
Yeah.
even our listeners know there is a whole lot to talk about.
Yeah, it really is.
And this area is so huge. It's so huge. And
Yes.
right, and the problems and issues that people are facing on a daily basis is like, again, that is huge as well. So the idea is, of course, to talk about it and overcome all of these issues. So if they would like to, I would like to tell our listeners that do give us a call, and we can direct you to the right person. So if you don't mind, give us a call at 901-849-DEEP. That's 849-3337. And you can also write or text us at that number, and write an email at sgp97@hotmail.com. Know that that whenever we have a show, we are always promoting good things, which means at times we will be talking about things that are not good and how to overcome them. And we have experts like Dr. Allen to talk about how to overcome those things. So thank you, Dr. Allen, for coming on our show.
My pleasure.
And we definitely want you to have on our show over and over again. And we have got good feedback from our viewers and asking some questions. So we would like you to continue that, ask questions, and we will have answers for you